So, Congressman Jeffries, as you watch the Senate take this on or not take it on, and as you hear the news that it's going to be another week probably that's going to be pushed back for consideration of a bill, what is your reaction to that, and how do you think the momentum and the attention could be sustained long enough for the sheer Democratic majority preference to manage to work its way into law?
Well, the progress in the Senate to date is important. The fact that you had the universal background check provision voted successfully out of committee, the federal anti-trafficking gun statute proposal voted out of committee, even the assault weapons ban voted out of committee, even though that may be tabled. And so that's a significant step in the right direction. Now when Congress returns, we've got to sustain the intensity and understand that the tactics that will be used by the NRA will probably be twofold. One, distortion of the facts and delay. You've got the real world and then you've got Wayne's World. And in Wayne's World, Wayne LaPierre articulates a view now, even though the NRA was once for universal background checks, now they're against it, that they're ineffective. Right. But the facts tell a very different story. Since 1994, I believe, when background checks were first implemented on a wide scale, more than or approximately 2 million people have been denied guns because of felony convictions, domestic violence problems, in order of protection. 2 million people. Now, that still means, though, however, given the loopholes, 40% of gun sales in the United States of America go without background checks. And so this can have a significant impact moving forward.
But and we looked at some research today. I mean, the literature, there's not a ton of literature, but there is some published peer-reviewed literature on trying to ascertain the connection between background check legislation and reductions in gun violence, and it does find a correlation between background check legislation and reductions in gun violence. Some of it finds a relatively small reduction, some of it finds a fairly significant. But you're right, here's Wayne LaPierre making the new case about not that background checks are evil, but they are simply futile or meaningless. This is the new line from the NRA. Take a look.
My problem with background checks is you're never going to get criminals to go through universal background checks.
Mr. LaPierre, that's the point. The criminals won't go to purchase the guns because there'll be a background check. We'll stop them from the original purchase. You missed that point completely. And I think it's basic.
Senator, I think you missed it.
Let there be order.
David, the background check for part of the Colorado legislation, was it the same argument more or less in Colorado, an argument of futility?
Absolutely. That's the argument. The perfect is the enemy of the good. Well, background checks won't catch everybody, so that means we shouldn't have more background checks, a universal system. It's a ridiculous argument. And the way to understand how ridiculous it is to think about the argument with other crimes. Well, if murderers won't follow laws outlawing murder, I guess we shouldn't have laws outlawing murder. Nobody says that. It's a ridiculous argument. It makes no sense. And I think that's why you see the polls show that 90% of the public supports universal background checks, because they understand that even if it won't solve everything, it's a step that needs to be taken.
I thought Hickenlooper actually had a really fascinating take on this, where he basically said, look, I was convinced of the utility of background checks by looking at the actual research. And I have to say, I too, I mean, obviously it makes sense to me at a common sense level, but when you look at the research, there's some research to support. They really do work. Here's Hickenlooper saying that.
People kept telling me, well, criminals aren't stupid and they're not going to look for background checks. Well, we went back and checked the statistics. 38 people applied to get or were trying to buy a gun who were either convicted or accused of homicides, 600 burglars, 1,300 felonious assaults. There were 400 people that had restraining orders from a judge that tried to buy a gun, and we stopped them. And 236 showed up to pick up their gun, and we arrested them because they had a warrant for a violent felony out for them. I mean, this thing works.
You're mayor of a city. You deal with gun violence. Does this sound? Is this persuasive to you? I imagine it is.
Universal checks are absolutely necessary, and I think that the American public is behind it. So to me, it's illogical that the people that we have as representatives would create this argument.
But they're behind it. This gets to the way Congress works. They're behind it if you call them up on their cell phones on a polling agency and say, do you support universal background checks for criminals? And people say, yeah, obviously. Click. then they go about their day, right? The question is, are they behind it enough that you and I were talking during the break, rallies in different cities in Connecticut to get this legislation passed, and big press events, and calling and lobbying, right? The question is that happening on Capitol Hill right now to transform a 90% majority approval for something into actual legislative action?
Well, I think the key is going to be to get the Senate to pass the bill. And if the Senate passes the bill, the spotlight is then shined on the House of Representatives. And John Boehner and the House GOP will have to confront reality. And at that point, the will of the American people will need to be expressed in the most vociferous way by lobbying their members of Congress, by rallies, and things of that nature.
Yeah, David, ask a question quick.
My question to you, Congressman Jeffries, is how much do you think gerrymandering plays into this? If the Republicans have gerrymandered their districts so much that they have to fear mostly a primary challenge from a pro-gun, pro-NRA challenger, does public opinion really matter if their main thing on their mind is, I don't want an NRA challenger in the primary, which ends up being the general election?
Well, that certainly will be the case with some of the more extreme members or those who are concerned about facing extreme right-wing primaries. But the one thing that we have witnessed over the last several months is that the Speaker has been willing to bring bills to the floor of the House of Representatives when pushed and being handed a finished product from the Senate Democratic majority. It happened on
Fiscal Cliff and the Sandy Supplemental.
And it happened on the Violence Against Women's Act,
that's three,
where there was reluctance. So it's the trifecta that has occurred already. I believe that if the bill lands on the floor of the House of Representatives and there's enough pressure that's brought to bear, to your point, it will not pass with a majority of Republicans supporting it.
But it will pass on the majority.
But it will pass on the majority.
Congressman Hakeem Jeffries in New York, Ohio State Representative Alicia Reece, Hartford, Connecticut Mayor Pedro Segarra.